So, the title is This Before Maryland, the story of Sir George Calvert. And this is a topic I've been researching for a long time, but I would like to pay credit to a particular person, Dr. John Krugler. Probably the best available study of the Lords Baltimore and the Calverts remains John Krugler's book, English and Catholic. And I certainly recommend it if you have not read it at this point. But in studying George, really, it's three chapters to his story. The first is youth and education, the second, the courtier, and the third, the colonizer. And as you all know, that story begins in northern England in Yorkshire, in Richmondshire, a rural area, mostly of farming. And there, in a place called Kipling, Leonard Calvert and his wife, Grace Crossland Calvert, lived. They were tenants of a Lord Wharton. He did not own the land. Most of the effort was grazing grain and livestock, especially sheep in that area. In late 1579 or early 1580, a son was born to them, George Calvert. Not long afterwards, Grace died, and Leonard remarries to a relative of Grace named Alice or Alicia. And George grows up in this rural setting. Now, the late David Fogel told me that he believed that the actual ancestral home is where that circle is on the map. But alas, archaeology has not been done yet to prove that. So I leave that an open hypothesis for your deliberation. But Northern Yorkshire was a stronghold of Catholics after the English Reformation, and efforts were made by the government to convert people to the Church of England, and the Calverts were Catholic. And a major event occurred in their lives in the year 1592. It was discovered that George and his younger brother Christopher were being taught by a Catholic tutor. This was forbidden, and the authorities came to the house. They ordered all the Catholic servants to be fired. They also took all of the religious objects related to Catholicism from the house, and they ordered Leonard to purchase 4 volumes. And it's likely these were the volumes: a Bible in English, the Book of Common Prayer, and a catechism. These were published and newly published around the time, and one other. These were to lay open on a table in the house so that all passersby would be able to read them. But the other thing that happened is they forcefully took George and Christopher from his family, sent them to a Protestant tutor. And from that point, 1592, George Calvert, from all outward appearances, became a member of the Church of England. They originally were sent to York, but a little bit later they went to Durham, the great cathedral city, where a relative, Robert Calvert, was teaching. He is likely the one that had a pivotal role in George's next step, and that was going to Oxford University at Trinity College. He entered in the summer of 1594. And in going through the various records of Trinity and of the university, we see traces of George showing up. Here, for example, in 1596, George's Calvert, College of Trinity. In those records, we also learn in 1597 that his tutor was a man named Wright, Robert Wright, a very prominent scholar who was later made a bishop of Bristol and then of Coventry. So he had a very effective background there. And at Oxford during this period, they really emphasized Studia Humanitas, the humanities, to encourage a spirit of learning, but also a quest for knowledge and even adventure in their young people. And particularly Vita Activa was a prominent goal, requiring virtuous action to achieve honor and glory. And hence, honorable deeds had to be done, not just contemplation, although contemplation was still important. And at Trinity, among the curriculum items, and it was all taught and spoken in Latin, we have logic, rhetoric, Latin and Greek languages, reading the original authors in the original Greek and Roman or Latin, natural philosophy, science, mathematics, theology, ethics, metaphysics, history, languages, a very diverse and full type of a curriculum there. And George apparently thrived in that environment. And his talent began to be recognized for the first time in the year 1596. The English ambassador to France, Henry Unton, suddenly died, and he was widely respected throughout England. And he was an Oxford graduate. So they took it upon, the university took it upon themselves to produce a series, a book about tributes to Sir Unton. And on one of the pages, there appears a brief Latin poem. And at the bottom, the author is Georgius Calvert from the College of Trinity. It is not grand prose, but it is a very beautifully written thing, showing that they were recognizing his language skills even at this point. Another important situation occurred, though, in February of 1597. George submitted a dispensation to the college and university. He wanted to graduate early. He wanted to graduate with completing only 13 terms instead of the 16 that was normally required. And the reason was that his parents wanted him to have law studied in London. So this was a request for a BA. He actually requested it, and it was approved on the 23rd day of February, 1597. And he graduated in July of that year in this church, St. Mary's Church, which is still the college church to this day. And during the graduation ceremonies, it was traditional to have dispensations, i.e., arguments between skilled scholars addressing a particular topic, the yay and the nay side of it. And I find it fascinating. What were the questions, some of the questions asked during that time period? As you will see, I think they might have influenced George a bit. The first one was the same kingdom ought not tolerate diverse religions. The next one, the removal of people to the colonies strengthens rather than weakens the public good. And finally, the submission of authority or government to reason is compelled by the laws of nature. Very interesting topics in philosophy and government that were asked at that time period. So George is able to get his BA degree from the University in Trinity College. And Trinity College, of course, is still a prominent part of the Oxford world. But in research there, I had a surprising discovery. The archivist I worked with knew of George Calvert, but virtually nobody else in the college knew of him. I was able to speak with Sir Ivor Roberts, the college president, and we said, wait a minute, we got to do something here. This is maybe your most important 16th century graduate. So with the wonderful efforts of Jean Roberts and Lynn, and funding from your society, we were able to have a large copy of George Calvert's painting. And in 2017, we presented that to Trinity College and President Roberts. The agreement was, though, that it should be displayed in a prominent location. And where was that? At the entrance to the dining hall, the ancient hall where all this faculty and students would come. So right there was George, so they would all learn about their most important 16th century alumni. So that was, I think, important to bring his in place. He went to Lincoln's Inn, one of the four Inns of Court in London, and entered in August of 1598, where he studied municipal law. Now, municipal law today is kind of city law. In the 17th century, it was urban law, but it was also county, national law, international things related to the law there. So it was a very broader sense of law activities that he was able to, he graduated and then spent about a year doing a grand tour of Europe. We have no idea where George went, but I'm sure he traveled widely. And in that effort, he tried to learn languages, especially French and maybe Italian. And something that I discovered is he returned not in early 1603, but sometime in mid-1602, where months before anybody thought it, he became a courtier in England. This was the change, the next step in his career. And I say that because there's a letter from January 1602, really 1603 in our style, from Robert Cecil talking about my servant George Calvert. He wanted the ambassador in France to take in George for 5 to 6 months to learn French, which he had learned partially out of his own efforts, and to gain continental experience. And a few months later, we have the oldest letter from George, written to Robert Cecil from Paris, with George as the earliest signature we have of him there. He was beginning the process of working for Robert Cecil. The next question is, who was Robert Cecil? He was an incredibly significant figure in England. He had been the Secretary of State for Queen Elizabeth. And when she died, he engineered the successful movement of James VI from Scotland to take over the throne of England without any controversy. As you can imagine, King James was a bit pretty pleased with what had happened there. And Robert Cecil became the key advisor to James, his Secretary of State, and later High Lord Treasurer. He was the most powerful man in England after the king. And George Calvert becomes his servant. Now, King James, of course, a very prominent man both in Scotland, then becomes the first James. His real name was James Charles Stuart, and he replaced the Tudors with the Stuart line that dominated 17th and early 18th century. He's most well known for that magnificent, beautiful translation, the King James Bible, which still remains one of my favorites of all the biblical translations there. A very important figure. He had Cecil begin prominent work. This, for example, is a famous painting showing the signing of a peace treaty with Spain that Cecil engineered. Cecil's even prominently located in the front of that picture there. So George began a process of learning the ways of government, but he didn't forget his personal actions. He married Anne Mim on the 22nd of November, 1604 in London. And at the end of 1605, they had their first son, a man that they named for Calvert's patron, Robert Cecil, the Earl of Salisbury. And I find it fascinating that his godfathers were the Earl of Salisbury and the Earl of Cumberland. That's pretty high-class godfathers, let me tell you. Okay. Calvert began as a clerk to Robert Cecil, but he rapidly, due to his talents, rose in responsibility. In 1605, he was asked to accompany the king and Cecil to Oxford, where George received an honorary master's degree from the university. In 1609, he was appointed clerk of the signet office by the king. Now, why is that significant? The signet office is the place where the letters for the king's signature were actually composed and drafted. It required somebody with great responsibility and discretion to work in that. This is showing the king had respect already for Calvert. And in 1609, due to Robert Cecil's works, he becomes a member of Parliament from a small town in Cornwall that he had absolutely no connection to. Okay, but that is the way politics worked in England at the time. In 1610, he was made a clerk of the Privy Council. The Privy Council was the group of elder statesmen that would advise the king on both domestic and foreign affairs. It was probably the most prominent, powerful group in England. And I find it wonderful that 8 years later, after starting as a clerk, George himself is promoted to be a member of the Privy Council to King James. But there was other things Cecil had in mind with him. Between August and March of 1610 to 1611, he sent George Calvert on an extended mission to Europe. He gave letters of introduction to various embassies around the country, provided £100 for his expenses. George apparently went to the Netherlands, France, and elsewhere. Why? Cecil never gave an explanation, but the rumors were that he was grooming him to be the ambassador of France or Brussels or maybe even Italy, but he never told him why. So George comes back and immediately is given another assignment. King James in 1611 recognized Calvert's ability and had him work directly with the king in the researching, discussions, and writing of a treatise about a Dutch theologian the king wanted to banish. This gave George intimate day-to-day contact with the King of England. And clearly, the king was very favorably impressed by this young man. In May of 1612, though, Robert Cecil died of illness. George was made one of the four of the executors of his estate and had a role in approving the absolutely elegant funerary monument for the Earl of Salisbury that in his personal chapel there. But this was a very serious situation. His patron was dead. And for many people, a commoner as he was, rising from very obscure things, most people would have simply lost their influence. But George had an ace in the hole, the king. The king respected him so much. And there was no immediate Secretary of State, so the king relied on George Calvert to execute foreign affairs, trusted him to answer all Latin, French, and Italian correspondence. He clearly had multiple language skills. In 1615, the king sent him on a very delicate trip to Germany, particularly to Heidelberg and a castle there. And the reason he went is because 2 years before, his daughter, Elizabeth, had been married to Frederick, the Elector of the Palatine, a principality in Germany. And the king wanted to be sure that her terms of her endowment had been properly executed. And there was another matter that was very delicate. Well, they had fulfilled her vows, including building a special gate that is absolutely magnificent that still stands there to commemorate the marriage. But the other thing was about 22 large ruby buttons, probably that would have been decorated a costume such as this. The king had given those to his daughter. And she had a servant woman who had worked for her for a long time, and she was leaving. And the queen had no real cash on her. So she said, well, why don't you take these rubies for the gift of your things? When James found out about it, he was upset. And he sent George to very delicately ask for them back. They were valued at about £1,000 sterling. He achieved this, and in response, Elizabeth said, I didn't realize they were worth so much. Well, they were, but this is the kind of things that the king is trusting him to do personal missions. During this time period, George and Anne bought a house on St. Martin's Lane, just above Trafalgar Square in the British National Gallery. And they worshiped in the church right there, St. Martin's in the Fields, which still stands. Indeed, one of their daughters was buried at St. Martin's in the Fields. But they lived on this avenue or a lane that was very prominent. I couldn't find a 17th century image of it, but it was a very elite area. And I found it wonderful about who was some of his neighbors living there. Well, the one was Sir Theodore Mavering, the king's physician, Daniel Mightons, the painter, Sir George Flint, the master of royal ceremonies, and according to David Fogel, Inigo Jones, the famed architect. All were his neighbors there. Pretty elite neighborhood for sure. But in 1616, something else happened. For the first time, George was able to own a rural estate. The king granted him the manor of Danby Wisk, not very far from Kipling, about 4 miles away. The manor house still stands there, which George probably stayed in occasionally when he came north. But this was his first major piece of ownership of a piece of the English countryside. In 1617, even more significantly, George is dubbed a knight by the king in a ceremony at Hampton Court. And the dubbing ceremony, which was from the medieval times, continues down to the day. I have a picture there of Queen Elizabeth dubbing the great actor there, as you will see in the foreground. So George became Sir George Calvert in the year 1617. And it's around this time that we have our first image of George Calvert. This was a miniature painted by the great miniature painter Peter Oliver. Dates somewhere between 1612 and 1618. My guess is closer to 12 because he looks pretty young in that picture there, but there's no agreement on the actual date. But we finally have a picture of this man. King James, the next year, approved 1619, approved George Calvert to be a principal Secretary of State. This was not due to the influence by others, but King James' personal decision to elevate him to one of the highest ranks in all of England. The key job was running foreign affairs of the kingdom, executing the king's orders. It had power, but it was also a very demanding job. This was a huge step to the pinnacle of George's career. And he entered that job in a time of great difficulty. Europe was divided not only by multiple nations, but each of these nations was also divided by religious controversy. And conflict, of course, was occurring between the various faiths throughout Europe. But there was something else that happened. A small kingdom called Bohemia, which was largely Catholic. Just north of it was the Palatine that Frederick was the leader of. And the king died, and they did a forced new king of Bohemia. And that king was Frederick of the Palatine, a Protestant. He was the one married to Elizabeth. This caused a revolt, and warfare began. King James had told him not to do it. Other advisors in other countries have said, don't do it. But Frederick was hard-headed, and he went ahead. It started a devastating conflict called the 30 Years' War. Between 5 and 8 million people died in Europe over this period, and parts of Germany were practically depopulated due to the death and destruction. So this was a conflict between Spain supporting the Spanish and the Dutch to some extent, the Swedes. It was a very complicated warfare. And King James supported his son-in-law, but he wanted to be a mediator. How could he bring about an end to this conflict? And he came up with the idea of a Spanish match. If he could marry his son, Prince Charles, to a princess in Spain, it would give him bargaining power so that he could hopefully bring that conflict to an end. And he started this in 1620, and he pushed it very strongly. He thought it was the answer to resolving that brutal war. And because of that, George Calvert had to begin the process of negotiating. He worked directly with the Spanish ambassador, Count Condor, who was in London. He was talking about negotiations. Condor was not very well liked. Here's a publication about him, Gondor, appearing as Machiavelli. He was considered such a nasty guy. But in any case, this brought George directly into the negotiations, and it was slow going. But in 1621, something else happened. George and his good friend Thomas Wentworth, both from Yorkshire, ran for Parliament. And George actually, through the efforts of Wentworth, won a seat representing the northern area of Yorkshire. But he barely won because nobody knew him. He had been gone for decades. And I think that is a cause for George doing something special. The next year, he begins construction of a major house at a place called Kipling. And Kipling, to show his status, but also to make him more known among the people there. He built a formal mansion at his birthplace and a formal retreat that most of you know well. I found no evidence that it was a hunting lodge, as some complains. It was a mansion. It was a home for the family in Yorkshire there. So there's the political and the housing all connects, I think, here. But he was also representing Yorkshire in the House of Commons, but he was also the king's spokesperson. He had to read the king's responses. He had to argue the king's position. He was constantly in front of Parliament, debating and championing the king's cause. A very challenging thing because there was a lot of opposition to this Spanish map among Parliament, especially a man named George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham. If George Calvert had a nemesis in life, it was the Duke of Buckingham. He didn't get along with George at all, and he championed a French match. George had to fight all of this in Parliament and behind the scenes. And major issues were money for troops. The king had sent mercenary troops to the Palatine to help his son-in-law, and the privileges Parliament wanted from the king. A very difficult time for things. So, and this is something that I don't know if many of you have seen. This is a very little known portrait of George Calvert. It was in Sir Francis Bacon's collection in St. Albans, and it's by Daniel Meitens. And what's nice about it is it shows George specifically as the Secretary of State. You will notice that he's holding documents. There's packets of letters on the table, and there is the Great Seal that he would use in this. And I want to draw your attention to that picture I showed you earlier of Robert Cecil. Look at the table. It's exactly the same thing on it. Clearly, this painting was meant to show George as the Secretary of State of England. 1622 was a very interesting year for George. He received a patent of nobility, and the Maryland Center for History and Culture owns it in the Calvert papers, and that is the beautiful, beautiful crest that was given by the Guild of Heraldry to George. And this is the first place where the Maryland motto appears. Contemporary people interpret it as strong deeds and gentle words. And it really represents. And George lost no time in starting to use it. Here are his wax seals. He started getting that seal in place regularly there. But 1622 also brought deep sorrow. In August 22nd, 22, his wife Anne dies. She was 42 years old, giving birth to their 11th child. This is the elegant tomb that I believe, and Lynn Roberts believes, was made by the master mason of the king, Nicholas Stone. And on it is a plaque. And this is the only image we have of Anne, perhaps made from a miniature of her that no longer survives. But George wrote, "She was a woman born to all excellent things, who has departed to a better world. For piety, chastity, and prudence, she was incomparable." Very high praise for the mother of his children. He was left to contend with 10 children, as long as all the issues of the Secretary of State job, an incredibly demanding situation for him. And then in the summer of 1623, another event that was of great significance. That summer, Prince Charles and Buckingham made a secret trip to Madrid. They were tired of the slowness of the negotiations with the Spanish, and they wanted to negotiate their own way through it. The Spanish prince and Charles didn't get along very well. The Spanish authorities were really angry that they were avoiding all the negotiations that had been so patently banished there. This incident, which George didn't know about until they left, utterly destroyed the whole idea of the Spanish match. By early 1624, it was dead. And those who were associated with it, who had argued for it over the years, were out of favor, including George Calvert. In April of that year, he begins to effort to resign the Secretary of State position, but he had requirements. He wanted remuneration for it, and he did not want to lose his reputation. And so that was what the negotiations began for this. And he refused to say that the match was a wrong-headed idea, because he has been such a strong supporter, he believed that that would have been hypocrisy to turn on something that he had supported, although it would have probably helped his career to some extent. The last time, in 1624, he is elected to Parliament serving Oxford University, and that concludes his parliamentary career. In 1623 or 24, I believe, he had Daniel Mytens the Elder paint this last major portrait, a magnificent thing of a courtier in all his splendor, his sword wearing gloves. This is the image that we all know of George Calvert, and it is a wonderful piece of art. But February of 1625 was a momentous month for George Calvert. He finally sells his Secretary of State office for £3,000 sterling. That's a lot of money. And he did so with honor. And that was extremely important to George. He converts to the Roman Catholic Church in that same time period, but he remains a member of the King's Privy Council despite being a Catholic. And we have some insight about this from the earliest biography of George, a man named Thomas Fuller in 1662, mentioned that Calvert sold his office, and he freely confessed himself to the king that he was then become a Roman Catholic, so that he must either be wanting in truth or violate his conscience in discharging his office. His ingenuity so highly affected King James that he continued him privy councillor all his reign, and soon after created him Lord Baltimore in Ireland. And this magnificent patent of nobility, also owned in the Calvert Papers by the Maryland Center for History and Culture, is what made him the Baron of Baltimore. A very momentous step, and we are 2.5 months away from the 400th anniversary of this event. Unfortunately, King James didn't live much longer. On New Year's Day, which was the 25th of March back then, 1625, he dies. His son, Prince Charles, becomes King Charles I. And Charles wanted to keep George Calvert as a member of the Privy Council, but he required all of them to take the oath of supremacy, that the king was head of the church. And as a Catholic, George could not take that oath. He explained that to King Charles, and he said, well, you can't be on the Privy Council, but you still have my respect, which was a very important thing there. So this begins the final stage of George Calvert's career, colonizer. It wasn't the beginning point of it, because he had long had an interest. His first contact with Ireland was in 1606, when he was made clerk of the crown for Connacht and Thomond area in the western part of it. We don't know if he ever visited there, but it was a good moneymaker for a young clerk. 1609, he invests in the Virginia Company. Never got a penny out of that investment, but he did invest in the East India Company, which was very lucrative at that time period. So his interest in overseas action was growing. 1613, King James sent him and 4 knights on a 4-month mission to Ireland to investigate Catholic grievances. This gave his an opportunity to travel throughout Ireland, understanding the political and religious situation, but also evaluating the bounty of the land. And it is interesting that in 1621, he acquired lands on opposite sides of the Atlantic, in Ireland and in Newfoundland. The Irish estates that he acquired was a manor of Elfeet up in Longford, County Longford, sort of in the upper middle of the colony. It had some good land there. The only remains of a manor of Elfeet is part of the Tower House that stood there, but it was fairly good agricultural land. And this was a location that he put some effort into, but we don't have much evidence that he spent a lot of time there. But it is also the area where the title Baltimore comes from, as the Lord of Baltimore. But where was Baltimore and what did it mean? There is no Baltimore City. There is no Baltimore Village. Baltimore means place of the big house. And trying to find that is pretty hard. But this is a monument to Lord Baltimore. It is along a farm lane that allegedly was called Baltimore Lane. I say allegedly because there's a story behind this. It was put up in the year 1974 to honor George. A group of Baltimore citizens put this in place. And the Council for County Longford, of course, did not want to feel ungrateful to their American delegation that came there. And so they found a spot on Baltimore land to put it up. The backstory is this was the time of increasing troubles in Ireland. Okay, putting a monument to an English settler in a major situation in England or in Ireland would not have gone over well. So they found a remote location along Baltimore Lane that even the IRA couldn't find. I couldn't find it today. It is really, but this is the only monument in the world to George Calvert. By 1625, though, he shifted his focus down south, a much more fertile area. Doesn't seem to have had much interest in Longford after this. And he had inspected that on the 1613 tour. And this is an account. The Lord Baltimore with his life in 1625 and family are now come to dwell in Ireland and reside at Ferns, County Wexford, where he hath purchased land of Sir Richard Masterson to the value of £1,600. The place is to be called Clohaman, where he will build. And in fact, Ferns Castle, where they stayed for a while, still exists. That is actually the chapel where George attended Mass while they lived there. And this is Clohaman. It is today, again, a small village. It was called My Lord Baltimore's Hound, where he built a large house and began the process of expanding his Irish holdings. He had over 7,000 acres in this part of Ireland and developed Clohaman. The problem is the house he built no longer exists. It was a ruin. This is the only drawing of the castle of Lord Baltimore at Clohaman, and work with James Littleton that I've had a privilege of working with there indicates archaeologically that it no longer exists, was destroyed by mining in the 19th century. But the other story about his colonization efforts comes from this book right here. In 1620, a man named Captain Richard Whitbourne published a Discourse and Discovery of Newfoundland with reasons of, wow, it's such a worthy place. George was given a copy of this before it was released to the public because he had to approve it. He seems to have been inspired by that. He acquired a grant to a place in Newfoundland, later called Avalon, and sent an expedition in 1621 to found a settlement there. Why Newfoundland? Well, Newfoundland itself isn't all that great. It did have forest, but there's something near Newfoundland that was really important. You ever heard of the Grand Banks and fishing? This was a major economic source for fishing, and that's why he settled or wanted to have a place there. He was sent back glowing records from his captain of his expedition. It is a beautiful land. It is fertile. There is so much good here. He finally visited in the summer of 1629 and found, and yes, it was quite impressive. And this is the manor house that was built for him, which has archaeologically been excavated, and a picture of the ferry. It's a nice harbor there, protected harbor there. He decided to move there permanently with his family in the year 1628, but he needed the king's permission to do so and asked the king, and permission was forthcoming. King Charles approved it and called his effort a good and laudable work, and it would add to the honor of our crown, the enlargement of our dominions, and to the good of our people. With this, the Calvert family left and arrived there. They arrived in mid-1628. It was quite lovely. There was fields. There was a beautiful environment. But what George had not been told about was the winter of Newfoundland. And he experienced it firsthand. He wrote, from mid-October to mid-May, there is a sad face of winter upon all this land, and the air is so intolerable cold that it is hardly to be endured. He also had half his people come down with sickness, including himself, and there was disputes between the Protestant minister and the Catholics. Nothing but trouble. He finally decided, I've had enough. Despite expending over 20,000 pounds sterling, that is a fortune, his entire accumulated wealth, he knew he had to abandon it and look elsewhere. And he wrote a letter. This is the actual letter in the British National Archives. It was such a thrill to actually hold it. It's such an amazing document because here he describes what's going on to King Charles. And he wrote, I have a strong temptation to leave all proceedings and plantations, to retire myself to my former quiet. But my inclination carrying me naturally to these kinds of works, I will further the best I may the enlarging your majesty's empire in this part of the world. Remember, vita activa, deeds, glorious deeds. That's what he is returning to here in his work. But the bottom of that letter is very significant for us. In it, he talks about your majesty's dominion in Virginia and ask his majesty to grant me a precinct of land there. This is 19 August. 1629. That is where Maryland begins, that very document right there. He sent it to the king along with his children on a ship going back to England, while he and his wife sailed for Virginia with their servants and all of his household goods. He expected to settle there, but was not well received for two reasons. He was on a committee in 1624 that ended the Virginia Company Charter. They were not very happy with Sir George Calvert over that. But secondly, as a Catholic, they demanded he take the oath of supremacy. And if he wouldn't do it for the king, he wasn't going to do it for these Virginians. Okay. They forced him to leave on his own without his wife, servants, or goods after only a short stay. But the important thing is he did have some opportunity to explore the Chesapeake and learned about the area. He returns to England, and in late 1629, probably arriving around Christmas, and immediately starts lobbying for a new charter. But the following year was not a good one. He was nearly broke. I mean, almost entire funding had been spent on Newfoundland. He had to get more money somewhere. His wife, Joan, their servants, and all his household goods, including his library, was lost in a shipwreck off of Ireland. And then in September, a servant woman came down with plague in his house, and he had to relocate to try to escape plague. It was not, she survived, but it was not a good year for him. But it was a year where, even though Vita Activa focuses on deeds, contemplation was also important. And I think the year 1630-31 was a critical time for George to think. The genesis of a new design for a colony. What had failed in Newfoundland? How was it a success and how was it completely wrong? What would it take to design a new colony where religious animosity would not destroy it, where there would be efforts there? He reflected on his youth, the 1592 event, but he also reflected on the nature of colonization and how it could add to the empire, how it could be done in an effective way. And out of this came the Maryland design. It was done with his son, Cecil, but also Father Andrew White, who had begun working with George in 1630. George continued to lobby for money and for a new charter. Key to this was his friends from the old Spanish match, Francis Cottington, Thomas Wentworth, and Thomas Howard, the Earl of Arundel, as well as, of course, the king, who respected him. And finally, progress after all that time. October of 1631, the king gave him a royal pension of £1,000 for 21 years each year, beginning on the New Year's Day, 25 March. And a warrant for a new charter issued in February from the king, but opposition to arose it immediately from the Virginians because he wanted the entire land south of the James River, and they were not having that. He quickly revises, quick on his feet, and says, I want the land north of the Potomac River. So a new warrant was issued by the king in late March of 1632, and things were moving forward rapidly. But this carefully developed plan for his new colony, after it had been designed, he never was able to complete it because he suddenly died in London on 15 April 1632. The charter finally received the King's Great Seal on 20 June, 5 weeks later, or 6 weeks later. So that pretty much was his final effort at colonizing. What about George Calvert, the man, and what is his legacy? Probably one of the best ways to learn about him is to understand what people who knew him said. 1621, the French ambassador wrote that George Calvert was a very good man, of good sense and understanding, well-intentioned, courteous toward foreigners, full of respect toward ambassadors, zealously intent for the welfare of England, but because of all these good qualities, entirely without authority or influence. He wasn't doing deception and underhanded stuff. And also, he was not a man who had an independent power base. He didn't own vast acreages of land. He didn't have a family that was intermarried into the aristocracy for generations. He did not have. He was from a humble beginning. But his success came from his talent, his loyalty, and the appreciation of the two most powerful men in England, Robert Cecil and King James. Throughout his career, George was hardworking, diligent, a skilled administrator, but loyal and honest. King James trusted him as a confidant, a gifted and discreet administrator, a staunch defender of the king's policies, and a prudent and loyal subject. Calvert becoming Catholic did not change that opinion of the king. And we know that King Charles felt the same way. We know that because that first biography in 1662 said, Calvert obtained from King Charles, who had as great an esteem of and affection for him as King James, a patent to him and his heirs for Maryland, a hopeful plantation. So he absolutely, the respect people had for him was there. And then in 1666, there's another biography published of George Calvert. And I'm going to read, it ends by saying there are two eminent things about this man. That though he was a Catholic, yet kept himself sincere and disengaged from conflict. And although a man of great judgment, yet not obstinate in his sentiments, but taking as great pleasure in hearing the opinions of others and in delivering his own. Something we need more of. But second, that he carried an exact account of affairs to his master, the king, every night, and took to himself the pains of examining the many letters which related to anything of importance regarding the kingdom. He was the only statesman that being engaged in a decried party, the Spanish match, okay, yet managed his businesses with that huge respect for all sides, that all who knew him applauded him, and none that had anything to do with him complained of him. High praise from his contemporaries. George Calvert was a practical visionary, as John Krugler has written. His unique Maryland design began by his sons and your ancestors who were on the Ark and the Dove, was a new and important chapter in the enduring struggle to liberate the human mind and soul from government-imposed mandates affecting religion and politics. Indeed, Maryland was the first demonstration that religious freedom could be achieved in a religiously diverse society in North America and within the expanding British Empire. George Calvert was a man of deep experience, wisdom, prudence, and caution, but he was also a risk taker, i.e. Newfoundland and Maryland. And he and his sons' enduring legacy is Maryland, and the powerful example that liberty of conscience could be a lived reality in a conflicted world. As I've studied George, I've become more impressed by his brilliance. As someone that sometimes struggles with one language, English, he mastered 5 or more languages. He was able to administer complicated affairs. He was a man who rose from humble beginnings to the peak of power, always retaining his integrity and honesty. He was an impressive figure. And I think that he deserves and merits much greater recognition than he has achieved. In history in the early 21st century, that recognition has decayed significantly, and we need to change that. But I think we should conclude from the fact that George Calvert was a remarkable individual who he and his son influenced the physical and intellectual shape of the land that became the United States. And the fact is that without George Calvert, there would not be a Maryland. So huzzah for George, and I thank you.